now we get to one of my absolute favorite things to talk about in this training, because it is important both for the children, parents, and ourselves, is the feelings thermometer. So you may be familiar with the feelings thermometer. However, I want to briefly describe kind of what it's like. Ideally, just like everything else in the world, we want to kind of be in that just right sort of format. But unfortunately, that's not always possible. Life interferes. It's craziness, but it is the truth. So, what do we want to do? Where are we on this? So if you're just right, you're going to be comfortable, you're not really stressed or anxious, you're pretty focused on what you're working, you're engaged in what you're doing. This is where we would all like to live permanently. It doesn't work like that in real life, unfortunately. So sometimes you're in that warm stage. You might be slightly uncomfortable. You could be like slightly stressed or anxious about something. It's distracting you a little bit. Not that you can't pull your control back in and refocus, but you know, there's something that's kind of really worrying you or in the back of your mind stressing you and making you anxious. This is what we call the warm stage. Now, I'm going to kind of go up and down, but I think we'll go ahead and we're going to alternate, so stay with me here. After the warm stage, when we move up the thermometer towards the hot, we're becoming moderately uncomfortable. This is where we are very distracted, we're edgy. This is where you'll sometimes see, you know, people shaking their knees or tapping their fingers, or really, it is noticeable that they are stressed and anxious. We had a judge here in Geary County when I first started with the program, and when she would start to get aggravated at something or really frustrated because she had to keep her judicial decorum, she would literally put her glasses on and take them off. And then 5 seconds later, and she had a leg that would tap, and we knew if her knee was bouncing up and down, and she started taking her glasses on and off like this, she was ticked. Now, those were her tells, but her face stayed very calm and everything else. But we could tell that she was very uncomfortable. She was starting to get very stressed or upset about this. Like, this is where you are literally trying to hold on to your control. Like, I'm an adult. I'm not going to, feed into this. The other part of that, the balancing part about that, is cool. This is where you're bored and you're losing your focus, but it's an internal struggle. It might not even be something that people are noticed. However, when you're in this kind of trauma moment, you are definitely not focused on what's going on. It's all in your head, but you are losing focus. It may seem like you're bored because you're not engaged at all. You've started to pull back and it's really kind of taken over your brain. Now, the two that we never, ever, ever want to deal with, and we'll just go down to the ice cold. It says totally bored here, but really I want you to think completely unfocused. You have disengaged yourself, and you are planning your escape. So one way to think about this is, if you've ever been in a relationship, you realize it's over, but there might be a special occasion, or there might be something going on and you're not quite ready to break it off, but you've already started to pull back on that relationship. You're starting to set boundaries. You're not as engaged. You've like put that wall up, and although you're there and you're going through the motions, you are planning how to leave this relationship. You are planning your escape from this relationship or this trauma or life in general. Unfortunately, this is a lot of times where people are highly traumatic and they could get those suicidal ideations. They're planning their escape. They're planning how they're going to leave this trauma. The other extreme is very hot. So you're extremely uncomfortable. You're very stressed and anxious. There's a need to get out of here now. The best way I like to describe this is, imagine one with claustrophobia, and they're in an elevator, and the elevator stops and gets stuck for whatever reason. Now, it might just be a momentary glitch and then it comes right back up, but that 30 or 60 seconds that they are stuck there, that tears through. They're so traumatized by their claustrophobia is taking over. That's the only thing that's on their mind right now, and they have this intense need to get out of the elevator no matter what. They're trying to bang on the door, they're trying to crawl out, they're trying to do... There's just this desire that they have to get out of the elevator immediately, even if it doesn't make sense logically. They have no logic left to their brain. They are like, I have to get out of here now. And if you can picture someone in that kind of a state, that is what we talk about on the very hot end of the thermometer. So why do I bring this up? Well, I'm going to be honest with you. One of the things that I will be throughout this training is very, very honest with you. It is not all sunshine and roses out there. These children have gone through real trauma. However, so have you in your life. And so we don't ever want to take it as it's just them that we're focused on. We as a CASA staff, we also want to be supportive of you, our CASA volunteer advocates. And that means you need to be able to take care of you too. Remember, one of our pillars was self-care. You need to understand that even if you've had a life very dissimilar to what our children have suffered, there might be things in your own past that start to trigger you. And being aware of where you are on the thermometer is very important. If I am completely stressed out and focused elsewhere and I'm not very engaged and I cannot get my brain to focus back, that is not a good time for me to visit a child when I am all ready for whatever is going on in my life. Hot or very hot or cool or ice cold on the feelings thermometer. So it's really important to understand that sometimes the cases could trigger you, sometimes something within the case, a person within the case, life in general may trigger you. We need to be mindful of that. And if that means you need to reschedule a child's visit, then you need to reschedule a child's visit, because it's really important that we give them our best, and that means taking care of you. Now, we also need to understand that we, completely unmeaning to, may do the same to somebody else. So we always want to kind of see where people are, both myself internally when I'm acting as a CASA volunteer advocate, myself as a staff member when I have a volunteer advocate with me, or we're in court, or whatever is going on. Where are they on that feelings thermometer? Where am I on that feelings thermometer? It's a good way to read the room, so to speak, and help understanding. Because if we know that someone's going through something, man, it's easier to give them much more patience, to think more carefully about how we word each particular sentence. And we do that sometimes even subconsciously, but it's helpful if we recognize that we can be even more conscious about it. Okay. So we want to always make sure that we're looking for these things and taking care of them. So what is child trauma? I mean, what is child trauma in general? I know you read through the article, so you've got a basic understanding. But you know we like definitions here. I'm just saying we do definitions here. And one of the things that we do is we look at each thing. Sorry. All right. So for us, child trauma is going to be defined as when that child either witnesses or experiences an event that poses in their mind a real or perceived threat. I'm going to come back to that in a second. To the life or well-being of the child or someone close to the child. So this event is going to make them feel fear and hopelessness, horror, just intense emotions, to the point that the child and or adult does not have the skill set to be able to deal with these kind of intense feelings. That is trauma. It has an effect on them because they don't have the skills, and sometimes not all skills will overcome every trauma. But I want to come back to a couple of things on this. First of all, let's start with the last one, which is that threat or that perceived threat could be made towards the child. If you don't, I will ... to you. But it could also be someone or something close to a child. So we have had instances where we have had small children, both boys and girls, who were sexually abused. And what was threatened was that one lovey, like a teddy bear, or their sister, or their mother, or their father, or their sibling, or someone else was threatened, and so they succumbed And so that is just as real. You'll always have those people where if I had to make a choice, I'd rather something bad happen to me and not my children, because it would be more traumatic for me for it to happen to my children. And then you have the people that it's more traumatic if it happens to them. They can, section it away in their brain a little bit easier if it happens to someone else as opposed to them. And so both are valid, and it's how each individual person is wired, so to speak. Okay, now I want to come back to real or perceived threat. And some threats are very, very real. If they're in a home where there's domestic violence or there's been abuse, that's very real. It has happened. It is not perceived. However, they can also read the signs. These children are phenomenal at reading the signs and watching what's going to happen, especially if they've been in a home with domestic violence. They learn to read the tells, and they will try to get themselves and their siblings or whomever to safety first because they see what's going to happen before it happens. It's an experience. Unfortunately, it's a learned experience for so many. So that is a perceived threat. They see that the potential is there. They see the lead up, and now they're very aware that it is likely to happen. That is a perceived threat. Another idea of a perceived threat, you don't realize, you just kind of go through life and you experience it, and you don't always realize it affects people differently. So I'm going to give you an example. I know this is going to be shocking, but we live in Kansas. Okay, not so shocking. And I have grandchildren that live on the Georgia-South Carolina border. And they visit us typically for about 3 weeks every summer. And about 2, maybe 3 summers ago now, as I record this, the eldest would have been 7 or 8, and her sister's 15 months younger, so like a year younger than she is. And we were driving home in the truck. Now, for those of you that don't know, we live out in the country. We do not live in the city of Junction City. We live out in the country. So it's about a 17-minute drive from downtown JC to our house. Lots of farmland, lots of ranch land. We get little bits of views from Milford Lake. I mean, it's a very pleasant drive, but it is a little bit of a drive. And as is the case in many places in Kansas, there's nothing. There's just nothing out there except the wonderful land that provides the food that we all eat. So we were out there and we were driving those back roads, and we had the local radio station. We had a local Junction City radio station playing. And they said that we had a tornado warning. And my husband and I know where this is. The 2 girls are in the back seat of the truck, and we're like heading home. Now, Rich, my husband, and I have had the discussion, where is that? Well, we know where it is. We know how fast the storm is traveling, so that we know we have probably a half hour to 45 minutes to make a 10-minute drive home based on where we were. We had plenty of time to get home, get the girls in the safe room, and be safe because there was a tornado. So we weren't really all that affected by it. The younger one, she wasn't affected by it either. However, my older granddaughter started panicking in the truck. She did not understand what we did. That was a real tornado that was going to strike imminently in her mind, and she saw that as a real threat. We did not perceive it to be a threat. She did, and she was very traumatized. And so then we had to, once we recognized immediately what was going on, okay, then we could talk her down. And I will say, we did talk her down. We helped her understand. We started to talk about all the different things. It was so far away. We only had 10 minutes to get home. We have a safe room. Here's what our safe room looks like. This is why we had talked to you, that if we ever tell you to run quick and go here, this is why, and da-da-da-da-da. And by the end of the trip, that 10 minutes, she was perfectly fine, and then was back to the side where, most of us in the Midwest are like, oh, cool, there's a tornado coming. Can I see it? Can I stay outside? No, she was not allowed to stay outside. But for her, that tornado was very, very real. And it was traumatizing for her in the moment. For the rest of us in the car, not so much. And when we asked her younger sister, Peyton said, well, I wasn't really worried because you and Bumpa, my husband, weren't worried about it, so I wasn't going to worry about it. two children reacting to the exact same stimulus the exact same way, and completely different results. So that's always very important to understand. It is that child's real or perceived threat. Okay. So there are 4 types of trauma, as you have read: acute, chronic, complex, and historical. So let's talk about acute trauma. I would say, think of an automobile accident. Boom, it happens, it's done. It could be very debilitating. It could just be a car accident, nobody's injured. But it's still impact. It could still be traumatizing for a child. Chronic. Now this is going to be ongoing traumatic events. Now they might be the same event over and over, like domestic violence where there's physical violence in the home. Or it could be, let's go back to our auto accident. Then you had one, or actually let's do a better example. Bullying at school. So you may have a child that is being bullied or physically assaulted at school, or that in that car accident there might have been some medical trauma or some other traumas that happened. You know, maybe they had an injury or someone had an injury, and so there's additional traumas. Those traumas do not all need to come from the same thing. They could be many traumas, little ones that add up together to be chronic. The next trauma that we will talk about is complex trauma. It is the worst, in my opinion. This is where you have acute and chronic, and they combine. These are ones that, even more than the others, completely impact a child's development. This one could be, I'm going to give you that automobile accident, right? So there's an automobile accident, and then one of the parents is injured, and then they have a long recovery, and now there's all these medical bills that they have to deal with, and they're trying to recover, and maybe they lose their job. Maybe they had a very physically demanding job, and they're no longer able to do that job. Okay, so now you're going to have loss of income. And then that, a lot of times, those stresses will cause friction between mom and dad, or, you know, the parents. And then one of them or both of them could potentially turn to drugs and alcohol to blot out all these negative things. And then that could have them, so they're losing their thing, or domestic violence now enters the picture. You see how this grows, and it becomes more and more complex, and there's more layers of trauma. You had this one event that caused all these layers of trauma. That is complex trauma. And then I want to talk a second about historical trauma. This is not as unknown as it once was, but this is a multi-generational trauma. This is a trauma that literally gets passed from generation to generation. And if you want to know how it biologically gets passed, we can point you some resources, but it does in some ways get biologically passed according to the most recent studies that we have seen. But this is the trauma experienced by a very specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. It is usually related to a major event of oppression. I want you to think of the Holocaust, or the Native American Trail of Tears, or slavery, things like this. These are major historical events that have happened, and that trauma passes from one generation to another. So factors impacting the effect of the trauma, like, you know, one of the things is I had two granddaughters. They were basically 15 months. They're 15 months apart, almost to the day, and completely same situation affected them completely differently. Well, a couple of things: the child's age or developmental stage, the child's perception of the danger faced. Reagan was very much, this is a real threat. Peyton was very much, Nona and Bumper are not upset, so I'm not going to get upset. Whether the child was a victim or a witness. We talked about that earlier. Sometimes it's more traumatizing if you're the victim, and sometimes it's more traumatizing if you're the witness and it's happening to someone else. The child's relationship to the victim or the perpetrator. So children are less likely to be, people are less likely to be traumatized by something that happens to someone in a country that they've never heard of before. You know, they've got no ties to that individual. They might think, oh, that's a horrible thing to have happened, but it's not going to affect them in the same way as it's someone that they care about. The other thing is their relationship with the perpetrator. If the perpetrator of the abuse is someone that they are, by culture and even more so, that they're supposed to depend on, like their mom or their dad, or their grandparent, they are more traumatized by that, because society and culture say that that's the person that's supposed to be protective of them, yet that's the person that is perpetrating the abuse or neglect. Past experience with trauma, we're going to talk about a little more about that later. Adversities the child faces following the trauma. Remember, we talked about that car accident and then how everything's stacked and layered up. And then one of the big ones is the availability of adults or trusted mentors who can offer help and protection. These all have major impact on how traumatized that child or that person becomes by the experience. So it's really important, as I've given you several examples, we want to treat these children and even the parents as individuals. We don't want to treat them as victims. When we treat them like victims, they stay victims. We want, and I've even talked to many survivors, and they don't like the term survivor either, because it still identifies them as part of that victimization prior, but they survived it, so now they're here. You're going to have to talk to them and see, but we want to treat them as individuals. They are people. Yes, they've gone through this. This is unfortunate. They've recovered from it. That's amazing. Look at how they've been able to overcome, but we still want to treat them as individuals. You may want to consider the child's past experiences with trauma and the types of trauma and different things like that. Now, one of the things that we can, and we're going to get more into recommendations later on in the training, but one of the things I always want to remind people of when I'm talking about this trauma unit is there is something called a trauma assessment. It is different from a mental health assessment. A mental health assessment is looking to assess if there are any mental health disorders, bipolar disorder or depression or things like that. However, a trauma screening is different. So especially if the child has a history of not doing well with other mental health therapies, that it might not be a mental health issue. It might be a trauma-related issue, and the treatment for that is completely different. As I have said before, these children and these families are actually number 2 to first responders in PTSD. It comes and looks very different in a variety of ways. So don't be at all afraid to recommend a trauma assessment or a trauma screening if you've got a child who has a list of past traumas that they've gone through and they haven't had that yet. And keep in mind, I've talked about primarily about children, but I've always been really careful to add in families or people or parents, because many of the situations we find in these cases is that the parents have unresolved trauma histories themselves. And so that's one of the reasons why you can always recommend that a parent undergo a trauma screening as well, as opposed to a mental health assessment, which is, again, looking for a mental health disorder. Trauma is a different animal. And so we really want to take that into consideration. So there's a lot you can request. Just make sure that you're not ordering. It's not like, oh, I have a new case, I'm going to automatically order this. You really want to look and see, and that's only going to come with conversation. So don't feel like you have to order it the first thing. As you build that rapport and relationship, then as they open up, you might find more to share. Questions to ask, even of yourself, they can help determine whether or not you really want that trauma assessment requested. Has the child experienced early and repeated exposure to overwhelming events? Is the child having difficulty controlling behavior on either extreme, or are they over controlling their behavior? Is the child having difficulty with sustaining attention, concentration, or learning? Going back to that feelings thermometer and how engaged are they? And we're not talking about regular things where kids are not, kids are engaged for a little while and then they're not because they're kids. But we want to make sure that if it's excessive, because then a lot of times we'll see it with their education. If they get triggered in the classroom by something, and it could be completely innocent, they're then in one of those modes where they've checked out and they're reliving that trauma. So now we're adding another layer of trauma. We're adding to the complex trauma. At the same time, they're not hearing what the teacher's saying, so now that they're not getting that educational information, even though they're sitting in the classroom, and so then they don't do as well on the tests and quizzes, and then that always has social consequences in school and different things like that. So we're just adding more on, which is why we really want to watch for those things, because we want to have them get the help with their trauma if needed. And then I do want to say that just because you want to necessarily recommend a trauma assessment for one child does not mean you need to recommend it for all children. You can. I'm not going to tell you that you can't, but you also want to consider that children are different. I talked about the difference between my two granddaughters. However, even when it's much more severe, I will talk to you about I met with 3 of the authors of a book called Foxhole Buddies, and it was they came to a conference we were at, and I sat in the session, and they talked about how there were 5 children and sexual abuse and physical abuse and things like that in their home. And then as adults, when they overcame it, 3 of them came together to write this book about their experiences and different things like that. And one of the things they said is they turned to their other siblings and they were like, well, we're going to do this. Do you want in on it? Do you want to be a part of it? And the other 2 siblings were like, I don't know what you're talking about. You're making this crap up. It's not that big of a deal. I don't know where you were living. You just keep making crap up. Well, there's 2 reasons for that. 1, the siblings could be in denial. Or 2, remember, they didn't see the same things as traumatizing. And so in this book, Foxhole Buddies, it's really clear, and they talk about this, and it's a great book. I highly recommend it if you have some free time. But that's one of those things that you want to be aware of, is you don't necessarily have to order the same thing for each child. You want to make it very individualized.